I come here as a brother, as a fellow Baha'i, a person who is engaged in the process of community building, like we all are. I think that the work that is being done here in this particular space that Liz and others have developed over a series of several years is really valuable and important, and that it's simply a bounty for me to be in this space with you. And so today I have a couple of ideas that I wanted to share. I hope that it will be not too onerous in terms of me speaking and other people listening. I don't know, that's just the mode of operation in the Zoom era that we're in. So forgive me for going on too long. And um, obviously these are just my own thoughts and ideas on certain concepts, and I offer them not with any form of prescription or anything like that, but more as a opportunity to create new thinking. Right, this is how I like to think about the exchange of ideas and the learning process that we're in. We have to learn our way forward. That's what I believe, and that the only way to do that is through action, right? Action and then reflection, using the means by which um, we have been guided through the Universal House of Justice. So today I'll share my screen with you here, and I chose in the title of New Narratives of Identity and New Narratives of Community. I'm of late quite interested in the idea of storytelling, right? I think that this is one of our kind of universally shared proclivities amongst human beings, right? Is this desire to share and hear stories. So much of what we think about who we are and the groups that we belong to and the identities that we carry are all enmeshed and embedded in the kinds of stories that we tell about ourselves, and that we tell about others, and we tell about history. And so this idea of narrative is basically like storytelling, new storytelling about identity, new storytelling about community is, I think, an important way for us to think about the process that we're involved in. Is everything good with my screen? Everyone can see that? Does that look nice? See the little painting there? Nice. Uh,
Yes.
paint. Okay, good, good. All right. So um, I'll begin by telling a story, and it has to do. Maybe some of you have heard it. I don't know. There was a king, and this king, he decided that he wanted to go out into his kingdom and see how the people were living. And so what he did is he dressed down, so to speak. He put on the garments of the commoner, and then he went out among the masses, among his people, and he observed. And he came upon one farmer, and he asked the farmer to spend some time with him. And he said, I'd like to talk with you a bit. And the farmer said, "Oh, that's wonderful. Come into my home. Let me show you some hospitality." And so the king went with the farmer into his home, and as the meal was prepared, the king began to converse with the farmer, and the farmer said to him, "Who are you? I never seen you around here. Who are you?" And the king said, "Well, I have some affiliation with the king's court. I kind of I'm a courtier in the court of the king, so to speak." And the farmer said, "Okay, all right, that's great. Welcome to my home. Welcome to my home." And then as the night went on a little bit more, um, the king said, "Earlier I told you that I was, a member of the king's court. But actually I have a different role. I mean, I'm actually an advisor to the king, a pretty close advisor." And the farmer said to him, "Yeah, that's great. That's cool. I'm glad that you're here with me." And then as the night drew to a close, the the king said to the farmer, I have to tell you something. Uh, I am the king himself. And when the farmer heard that, he was a little bit incredulous. He was like, well, why wouldn't you have just told me that before? Like, why did it take you so long to come there, right? To come to this point. And I offer that story as a kind of analogy for the way that I think that we need to think, that we can think and we can express our relationship um, to, or the station of, Baha'u'llah, right? As Baha'i, sometimes we kind of, I think, forget, I can forget the actual station of Baha'u'llah, the promised one of all ages, the figure through whom we will eventually build the kingdom of God on earth, right? This kind of trans historical figure whose ideas, right, whose revelation forms the system through which we will bring about nothing more or nothing less than the absolute transformation of human civilization as it's known, right? And so when we think of Baha'u'llah, when we express our commitment to this vision of his, like, I think it's necessary for me personally to always call to mind the incredible station of the figure who draws us here together this morning, right? And so I share that because what I see myself involved in, and as I see probably many of you are similarly see yourselves involved in, right, is a process of historical transformation, right? We are trying to build something that is going to alter human history. And so we have to have, I think, a vision of the future, right? And we have to hold to that with all of our intention, and that in order for us to hold to that vision and to kind of live it out and to be inspired by it, I think that we also have to have a historical vision, right? We simultaneously have to have a historical vision that tells us the right stories or the empowering stories of the past, right? So that we can have a story about the future, right, which is going to be viable and invigorating, and something that can um, hold our attention and commitment as we work tirelessly to bring it about, right? And so, um, what I want to talk about today is like this, to begin with, is like uh, stories about our historical vision, new stories about our historical vision, and then um, developing stories about our prophetic vision, this vision of the future that we have. Those are the kinds of, there's two things that I kind of really want to get at today. Um, and I think that I'll begin with the historical vision. And we are, I believe, not instructed, but um, set in the direction of developing historical vision by Baha'u'llah in nothing less than the Kitabi Igan, right? When one of the Bab's uncles asked Baha'u'llah these questions about the station, how could it be that his nephew was, the one who, the promised Kayam, right? Baha'u'llah begins by answering the Bab's uncle with a vision of history, right? If you look at the first part of the Kitabi Igan, there is this rehearsal of the history of the prophets and what they endured, and the historical context in which the great prophets of the tradition existed in. And so I think it is actually um, underwritten, the development of historical vision is underwritten by the process, the method by which Baha'u'llah attempted to help the Bab's uncle understand their own historical moment, right? So Baha'u'llah doesn't just begin by saying, okay, here's how you understand the station of your nephew right now, right? He says, first, let us think about history, right? And how we got here. And so I think that we are quite in line with a method deployed by Baha'u'llah and what Chogi Effendi calls, his second most important text after the Kitabi Akdas, right? When we develop historical vision, right? And so I think many of you might agree that the historical vision which is offered to us in the culture at large, in our systems of education and so forth, is somewhat distorted, right? And in fact, it may not be actually as empowering as we need it to be, right? It may not actually be useful in allowing us to achieve the prophetic vision that we have for ourselves as Baha'is, right? And so I think it's important that we develop these new stories about history and who we are, stories that aren't necessarily going to be offered to us in much of the culture at large, and certainly not within many of the institutions of education that our young people are coming through and that we ourselves may have come through, right? Yet at the same time, this development of new stories is not something that is unique to Baha'is, right? This is something that is going on in the thinking of so many, and it has been going on for decades in certain sectors of the community. Of the American, I'll just speak of the American community right now, particularly within African American community. There has been always, for the last 100 years, a real concerted effort to develop a story about the past, which can be sustaining and powerful and transformational, right? And so one of the ways that we see that happening in the contemporary, right, is through something maybe y'all are familiar with, which is like the 1619 Project, right? And in the 1619 Project, what we see is a effort to um, transform our understanding of where we are and who we are by beginning our story about America at a different place than where we usually do, right? Which is not in 1776, but rather in 1619, that moment when the first enslaved Africans were not really the first enslaved African, but some of the first enslaved Africans were brought ashore in Virginia, right? And so by rooting our story about America in that moment, it transforms the way that we think about who we are as a people and where we have come from, and the um, project of America in its moral and ethical figuration, let's say, right? But we can, I don't know how y'all think about that, right? When you think of 1619 and you imagine those people brought off of that boat. And I kind of, I feel when I think about it, I kind of have this image in my mind of, people who are sort of downtrodden and bearing the burdens of a kind of oppression. Um and I'm not sure that that's really, the place where we want to think about the origins of blackness from. You know what I'm saying? There may be other ways that we can think about the origins of blackness, which are actually far more empowering and expansive, and help us to think even beyond, right? This idea of like a history, a narrative of oppression, which must be transcended in the era of modernity. So one of the things, and this is not to at all kind of under cut the efforts and the good work that I think has been achieved through the 1619 projects. It's very powerful in terms of its ability to transform our narratives and its intervention into the discourse of our moment, right? But I think that I'm interested in this idea of like a 1319 project, right? And so if we think about like a 1319 project and we go back eastward across the Atlantic into the area of what the Senegambia, where so many of the enslaved people who were brought to the New World would sort of trace their roots. What we find in 1319 is a incredible human civilization, right? In fact, one of the human civilizations that was pivotal in the development of all of human history at that moment, right? And this is the kingdom of Mali. And in the kingdom of Mali in 1319, we find ourselves in the midst of, and this is in Western Africa. Um, the kind of orangish color is that salmon colored outline there in West Africa. This is the extension. This is the extensive kingdom of Mali in 1319, under the leadership of one of the most powerful political figures alive at that time, and perhaps even alive in all of history, Mansa Musa. Right, and Mansa Musa was the ruler of the kingdom of Mali, and in 1319 he was beginning to plan out his pilgrimage to Mecca. Right, he was a practicing, Muslim. Islam had been in West Africa for hundreds of years at that point. It had, let's say, synchronized with the culture of that region of the world, and had created really sophisticated and powerful political states, which, as I said, were transforming world history at that time. And so Mansa Musa, as a devout Muslim, was preparing his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1319. But not only that, right? He was preparing more than a pilgrimage in a religious sense. He was also preparing a kind of political endeavor, a political enterprise, as he was going to make this 3,000 mile trek across the Sahara into the heart of, like, the Islamic Empire at that time, to go to Mecca. And so in 1324, he makes that eastward journey, and he travels through Cairo on his way to Mecca. When he gets to Cairo, one of the things that is fascinating is his wealth is so immense that when he begins to dole out, right, his gifts and buy up merchandise in Cairo, it has the effect of disrupting the economy of the entire Mediterranean region for 10 years. And that's because in Western Africa, in Mali at that time, it was the source of, it's thought to be between half and two-thirds of the gold, right, that was circulating in the world economy at that time, right? And so when he arrived in Mecca, when he arrived in Cairo, he had with him 600 enslaved people, each of whom was carrying a staff of 6 pounds of gold, and behind them was a retinue of camels, a caravan. And that caravan had 600 camels in it. Each of those camels was weighed down by 100 pounds of gold, right? And in that entire entourage, there were, between, the historians don't know the exact number, some say as little as well, some say as many as 60,000, and some say the smallest number is 10,000, right? So imagine the kind of effect that this had on the world, right? That here was this West African empire that had developed, and that its leader had now come eastward to do his obligatory Hajj. And when he did that, right, he was not simply, as I said, performing a religious rite. He was also undertaking a political enterprise. And what he aimed to do was gather up some of the greatest minds of the Islamic world of that era and attract them back to West Africa. And in fact, that's what happened, right? When he went back to Mali, he was able to take with him significant scientists, right? Significant poets and architects. And in the years after his return from pilgrimage, we have the arising of the city of Timbuktu, which was a center of knowledge in what we can call, the era of antiquity. And in that city of Timbuktu, there was one of the most important centers of learning in the world at that time. There was a kind of university in which you had thousands upon thousands of scholars studying, and you had manuscripts numbering in the hundreds of thousands written in Arabic, and also written using the Arabic script, representing the West African languages of the era, right? And so, in that Islamic center of learning, you had the incubation of knowledge, which was then transferred out to the rest of the world, up into Europe, right, back to the East, back even to the Far East, and so forth, right? And what I'm trying to argue is that what you have in West Africa at that time is a fully empowered center of learning and political genius, right? That contributed to the evolution of human history, right? And was just as significant as any other civilization, right? Which has existed for the last 500 years, 1,000 years, right? Yet at the same time, right, most of us, are totally unaware of that. We have no knowledge of the fact of this incredible empire ever even existing, right? We have little knowledge of the fact that, some historians think about 20% of those New World Africans, right, were Muslims, practicing Muslims, right? Many of us are kind of unaware of that. And so here is this is another image of a map of that was created by a cartographer in Spain of that era, and then presented to the Christian king Charlemagne in the mid 14th century. And you can see Mansa Musa at the bottom corner of the map, sort of holding this nugget of gold with a crown of gold and a scepter, sitting in the midst of West Africa there. And so I think that it's important for us to recognize that there's a reason that we don't understand that history, that we don't know that history, right? And it has to do with the process that unfolded in the several hundred years after the reign of Mansa Musa. Eventually, as all empires do, the Mali Empire declined. It was there was incursions from the Moroccan Empire, right? And then eventually we have the beginnings of the African slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, in the primarily in the 15th century, well, the 16th century onward, right? And of course, what happens in that period is a total transformation of the world, right? A total transformation of the world in a way that we haven't really sort of wrapped our minds around. And one of the ways that I like to help my students think about how massive the transformation was, and how distorted our understanding of that transformation was, is by asking this question, right? So obviously I'm using these terms kind of euphemistically, right? So I put them in quotation marks, but there's a question that we might ask ourselves: how many immigrants shifted from the old world? And when we think of the old world, we're thinking about Europe and Africa, right? To the new world, and that would be the Americas, North America, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, right? Between 1492 and 1776, right? These are kind of like iconic years in the narrative of history that we are often sort of set within, right? And so, there's you can imagine what, I'm not going to take hands or anything, but you can imagine what the number is, right? So you have a number in your mind, right? So there are these many people who have shifted, some enslaved, others who are doing the enslaving primarily, or not necessarily doing the enslaving, but are not enslaved Europeans. And so that the number there is about 6.5 million, right? So the beginning of what we think of as New World history, that first about 300 years of New World history that we are, oftentimes conversant with in the West. Not that this is where the history of the Americas begins. We know that, right? But the period of history that we often think about, there are about 6.5 million people who make that journey from east to west, so to speak, right? And so the next question that we might ask ourselves is, in that 300-year early history of the New World, how many of the people who made that shift were African? right? And here's where we can come to a kind of a surprising understanding, right? The reality is that 5.5 million people, right, were enslaved and brought over, right? So that means that upwards of 80% of those who are undertaking the project, right, of the New World for its first 300 years are actually enslaved Africans, which means, of course, then that the New World, as we came to understand it and we came to inhabit it, right, was in fact totally created out of the labor, right, and sacrifice of African people. I mean, that's something that I was always a sort of fairly well-read, young person, and I understood the basic outlines of Atlantic slave trade and that kind of thing. But I remember when I came across this number, it hit me in a really stark way that my perception of New World history, the history of modernity, as the creation of Europeans was quite a distorted perception, right? That in fact, the foundations of our cultural, our intellectual, even history, right, are established by people like the Wolof, people like Igbo, people like Akan, right? People like Mandinka, right? All of these West African nations, which became black, right, in the process of this New World slave trade. And in the time of the New World slave trade, right, when all of these people are amalgamated into this one group that we think of as black, the same thing was happening with this disparate group of Europeans, right? Portuguese and Spanish and English and French and Protestants and Catholics, right? They become amalgamated underneath this category of whiteness, right? And so we have the creation of these differing sort of groups of people, and the narrative of history that we get is one in which it is the whites, right, which were the progenitors, the great creators of this New World history that we are now the recipients of, right? When in fact, right, if we think about the actual labor that went into all this, and so much of the knowledge, we can't just think about it as simply an act of labor, right? But there's cultural know-how, what we think of as epistemology, ways of knowing, right, that were contributed by Africans in ways that were totally erased. Okay. And so um we have to think about that. We also have to think about the fact that, right, that there was a great exploitation, a great harm that was done, right? And in that exploitation, we had a great deal of wealth that was created, right? And so that wealth that was created and that harm that was done still shapes the reality that we have today, right? And so much of the disparity in within nations, right, much of the wealth disparity that we see within nations is tied to this history of exploitation based on the constructed category of race. Much of the disparity that we see in the material well-being of nations across the globe is tied to this history of exploitation and wealth creation that has been in effect for about 500 years now, right? So without that exploitation, there could never have been that massive degree of wealth creation. If some of you have been to Paris, maybe some of you have been to the Palace of Versailles, right? And the Palace of Versailles was, kind of, it was built up, over a period of a couple hundred years, but primarily much of the building was done in the 18th and then also in the 19th century, but primarily in the 18th century, right? In the 1700s. In the 1700s, what was the crown jewel of the European colonial empires, right, of that era? It was the nation of Haiti, right? What we think of as Haiti today, right? Saint Dominique. That was in the 18th century the crown jewel of all European empires. It was the one place in the world that was creating the most wealth, right? Of course, we can think the great deal of we can think how tragically ironic it is that in the Western Hemisphere today, right, Haiti is the poorest nation, right? Haiti is also the first nation to actually live out the principles of justice and equality and freedom, right? That were supposedly at the heart of European intellectual projects, right? So Haiti becomes a free nation in the early part of the 19th century when, we have the Haitian Revolution, um, in which the enslaved people throw off the French Empire. But during that time in the 17th century, all of the massive wealth creation that was built up in Haiti was flowing back to France. Right, and so I often think of us. We should, as Liz said, we in this period of um, 2021, we're remembering the centenary of Abdul Baha's passing, and we are meant to continually call to mind the example of Abdul Baha. And I always think, when I think of that sort of colonial history of France and Haiti, I think of that story when Abdul Baha was on his way to America uh, in 1911. I think it would have been, he was passing through Europe, and he's in Paris, and he's staying in a hotel. And in that hotel, right, he has developed friendships with people who are in the area. And one of the people who he has developed a friendship with is a poor uh, black man, right? And that man has been visiting Abdul Baha. And when the hotelier becomes aware of this regular visitation by this poor black man, he turns him away. And of course, Abdul Baha finds out about this, and he tells him, no, 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 this is not the way it is. You have to go and retrieve this man and bring him back to me, right? I came to spend time with him. And there is I'm going to paraphrase here, but Abdul Baha says, I didn't come to Europe, I didn't come to France to replicate the patterns of life that are extant here, right? I came to Paris to live out the standard of Baha'u'llah, right? And so it seems to me so telling that, in this city of opulence and wealth, right, which was all available to Abdul Baha in that time, right? He turns his back metaphorically on that and says, I didn't come here for all that, right? I came here to establish these bonds of unity with people who are representative, let's say, in that poor black man, of those who have been exploited in this process of the creation of new world history that we're talking about here. So we can think about this in the American context in the same light, right? Of course, we don't have to go through all this history. You all know this. The 19th century's most wealth generating export for America, we know that's cotton, right? And we know that cotton was developed on uh, plantations, primarily in southern states, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, so forth, right? But let me tell you another story here to just justify this kind of a place that I have to go to in order for us to really think about the depth of our struggle, right? Um, there was this one time I had went to a parking lot late at night, and I lost my keys to my car, and it was really, really dark out, and I started looking for my keys, and there was a street lamp, and I started looking for my keys underneath this street lamp. And then other people started to help me look for the keys underneath the street lamp. And we're frantically looking about. And then this woman comes up behind us, and she's like, what are you all doing? And I say, I lost my keys. And so we're looking for them. And then she says, well, did you lose your keys underneath the street lamp? I was like, no, I didn't lose my keys underneath here. I lost them out there in the darkness, but why would I want to look there? Right there, here's where the light is. And so I tell that story oftentimes. My kids get kind of sick of hearing me. They've heard me tell the story so many times. So, uh, but I tell that story because, in fact, really, we need to think about looking into those dark places to understand, our history and to gain the keys, right, for unlocking the possibility of the future. And so one of the darkest places that we might have to look, right, is in the systematic exploitation of women, both physically, in terms of their labor in the fields, but also sexually, right? A kind of systematized, you know, sexual assault and rape that went on for generation after generation after generation, right? And so if you all are familiar with the movie or the narrative of Solomon Northup, 12 Years a Slave, one of the things that you will remember is the figure of Patsy, played by Lupita Nyong'o in the filmic version of this narrative that he wrote. And of course, Solomon Northup was an enslaved. He was born free in Saratoga, New York, and then lured into the South, right? Um, and enslaved and spent 12 years on cotton plantations, primarily in Louisiana. And in his narrative, he talks about Patsy as the most efficient and prized cotton picker in the whole region of Louisiana where he was, right? So I remember when I came upon that, it really sort of transformed the way that I thought about the labor of the Southern cotton plantation, because I had always thought about labor in among enslaved people as like men's work. You know what I mean? Like it required brawn and muscle and that type of thing. But in fact, because cotton picking was a process that was um, really tied to manual dexterity, how fast you were with your hands. It was actually women who could produce the most cotton on a plantation, and Patsy was one of those people, right? And so then we have to think about, okay, so you have women who are very efficient and prize cotton pickers, and how are they um, induced to produce more cotton? It's through a system of essentially torture, right? Because what you would have is your quota for the day. You have 50 pounds of cotton that you're supposed to pick for the day, right? And if you don't reach that quota, what might be done to you, right? Maybe you get a scolding, right? Maybe you are deprived of something. But there's a much more efficient way, and a way that was used, on the regular, as we say, right? Which was the whip, right? And so the whip was the means of extracting more efficient labor practices from enslaved people and enslaved women, right? So you think about that system of torture that goes on for generation after generation. And then you have to think about the way that, right, someone like Patsy, and this is true in the narrative that Solomon Northup tells, right? Someone like Patsy might catch the eye, right, of an overseer, or of someone who is in a position to sexually exploit her. And after doing a day's labor, right, in the fields, then she is raped at night. You know what I'm saying? And then she's sent back into the field the next day, right? And then there's a possibility that she falls pregnant, right? And then when she's impregnated, her work slows, right? And then there's a possibility that because she is impregnated with the child of one of the people who is enslaving her, right? She's going to be subjected to more torture by whip. You know what I'm saying? So that's the reality, right, of the economy that grew up in the 19th century and planted the seed of American greatness as a world power that we have today, right? It's from that cotton industry that the foundation of American greatness as an economic power is established. And you can see that, like, I'm involved in an interesting project where there's this one painter who has taken the Southern currency, right? And Southern currency has on it these many, many depictions of enslaved Africans, enslaved Black people, doing their work. And so it's right there on the bills, right, of the American economy, showing the labor that is producing all of the wealth in the nation at that time, or a great portion of the wealth is being created at that time, right? And so, we can't think that, of course, this is just like happening in the South, right? This cotton plantation economy is tentacled out into so many parts of the world, right? Into the northern cities, in fact, into the European cities, right? And there's an insurance policies that have to be taken out on enslaved people, and there's mortgages that you have to get to buy more enslaved people, right? And so there's this whole great economy which is developing around the institution of um, slavery in the South and the exploitation of people there, right? So it's not just something that is kind of like confined to the South, right? So we have this incredible story of exploitation, and I tell it, I tell it not because you don't know it, right? But to also think about like what it then leads to, right? It requires this kind of story of this reality of exploitation requires a story that legitimates it, right? You've got to somehow legitimate this incredible wrong that is being done, right? You've got to come up with an ideology that justifies it, right? And it's not just a great story of exploitation, it's a great story of violence, right? There's this incredible violence that is involved in this exploitation. And so you got to justify that too. And so when we think about the need to justify this exploitation and this violence, then you begin and you see how big the project was. It was nothing less than the institution that was at the heart of the modern world economy, right? The creation of the new world history is fully enmeshed in this exploitative violence, right? And so obviously then you have to develop a story that legitimates that exploitation and that violence. And the story that we get is one that is tied to these two tandem ideologies of white supremacy and anti-blackness, right? So the only way to justify this is to say that there is something inherently superior, right, about those who are, who we call white, and there's something inherently inferior about those who we call black, right? And so we see the power of this ideology when we recognize how essential it was to the creation of modern history in the West. So this kind of thing is sort of like tied to a basic sociological principle that you can read in like like this is a guy's a French sociologist who's very influential in the late 20th century and the early 21st century, Pierre Bourdieu. And like he teaches, and it's kind of obvious when you think about it, that unequal power relations require strategies of legitimation, right? You got to legitimate the fact that I'm making all this money up here and you're not making nothing, right? I got to tell myself that my education and my training, right, my hard work justifies, right, my superior station or my superior economic well-being, I got to develop some kind of story to tell myself that it's true, right? So I got to say that I've worked hard, that I have this education, I have this intelligence or something like that, and that those other people, they don't deserve what I have, right? And so that's I'm saying like this is what we do today for ourselves, right? But on a global scale and on a world historical scale, the way that we have justified this exploitation is by the exploitation of Africans, right? Is by developing stigmas, right? Stories of stigma, saying that there's something wrong with blackness, right? Saying something right about whiteness, right? And so, I tell all that story, I tell all that history because it is part of the story that we have used to develop identity in the contemporary, right? This is so much of our identity is shaped by this history that is never talked about and never really thought of. And so I like to rehearse it because I think that once we sort of clarify it, then we can begin to imagine new identities and new stories, right? And so we have within our own faith the great fortune, right, of having new stories of identity that have been articulated for us by nothing less than, right, the mouthpiece of divinity in the world today, right, which is Baha'u'llah, right? So these new stories of identity were given to us, you know, I think in a powerful way through the pupil of the eye metaphor, right? That we know Baha'u'llah used to describe Black people, right? And so I don't know how many of you are familiar with like perhaps the first time that this people of the eye metaphor appears, right? It's attached to a letter that Robert Turner receives from Abdul Baha. And probably, y'all have heard the story of Robert Turner as the first African American Baha'i. He was the butler of Phoebe Hearst. And Phoebe Hearst, as you may know, like was the mother of William Randolph Hearst, who was the great and sometimes despised magnate of yellow journalism in the early part of the 20th century, early and mid 20th century. But that Hearst family of the late 19th century and early 20th century was one of the most powerful American families. And Robert Turner was the butler of Phoebe Hearst. And Lua Getzinger had run across Getzinger, the great teacher of the Baha'i Faith. Um, in the late 19th century, had run across Phoebe Hearst, and they began conversing and about the Baha'i Faith. And um, Turner overheard these conversations, right? And he became attracted to it. He became attracted to the faith himself. And so when Phoebe Hearst organizes the first cohort of Western pilgrims to go to meet Abdul Baha in Akka in 1899, Robert Turner is amongst that group, right? And so when they arrive there and they spend some time outside of Akka, and then they're invited to meet Abdul Baha, Turner is with them, but Turner refuses to go into the room, with the other Western pilgrims that were in his group. And so they all file into this room in Akka, and Abdul Baha is aware of the fact that one person is missing, right? So as Louis Gregory tells this story in The Star of the West, Abdul Baha goes out of the room, and then he sees Robert Turner, and he says, "You need to come in with us." And Turner, feeling himself unworthy, sort of falls to his knees and says, "No, I shouldn't be there. I'm just, a lowly servant." And Abdul Baha, lifts him up, embraces him, and takes him in to the room with the rest of the pilgrims, right? And so one of the things that we don't have is the letter that Robert Turner sends along with this photograph back to Abdul Baha after the pilgrimage is complete, right? We don't have that letter as far as I know. And but we do have Abdul Baha's response to Turner, right? And in that response is one of the first times I think that we ever see this people of the eye metaphor. And it's a beautiful response because you can hear in Abdul Baha's response the anxiety, right, that must have been inside of that letter that was written by Turner, who probably thought that Abdul Baha, although he showed him such kindness, had likely forgotten about him, a lowly servant, you know, amongst those who were some of the most powerful people in America at that time, right? But when Abdul Baha writes back to him, he says, this is the quotation, right? "O thou who art pure in heart, sanctified in spirit, peerless in character, beauteous in face, thy photograph hath been revealed, have been received," right? And he says, okay, I got this, and this is the photograph that Robert Turner sent to him. And then what does Abdul Baha say about the photograph? "Revealing thy physical frame and the utmost grace and best appearance," right? So all that history, that New World history that had generated anti-Blackness, which had associated everything negative and the antithesis of beauty, right, with Blackness, right? Abdul Baha is saying, no, 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 that's not the story that we are abiding by in this faith, right? In fact, we're seeing something exactly the opposite. "Thou art dark in countenance and bright in character. Thou art like unto the pupil of the eye, which is dark in color, yet is the fount of light and the revealer of the contingent world. I have not forgotten, nor will I forget thee." Right? Now, this is really important for us as Baha'is, I think, you know, because it instructs us on the type of story that we are meant to tell, right? And understand about the reality of Blackness, right? It is not something that is to be degraded in any way, right? It is not something that is to be recognized with any kind of stigma attached to it. In fact, right, it's the antithesis of that, right? It's the fount of light, the revealer of spiritual truth, right? And so I'm not the kind of person that says, well, there is some kind of essential difference between black people and white people are all so, I don't really subscribe to that kind of thinking. But what I do subscribe to is the idea that there has been such a terrible sort of story told about Blackness throughout history that it was necessary for Baha'u'llah, in order to achieve his aim of the unity of all humanity, to give us this metaphor which offers an elevated estimation of Blackness, to undo, to retell a story about Blackness, right? That we are the inheritors of, ethnic society at large. Within the Baha'i Faith, we're not the inheritors of that story. We are the inheritors of this new story that's given to us by Baha'u'llah. Um, so as we develop these new stories of identity in the faith, in the Baha'i Faith, right? What do we use them for? It's not like we just have like this kind of like the nice people of the eye metaphor. Well, that's cool. That's wonderful. We are, we have this new way of thinking about Blackness, right? Um, and we have to think about this, I think, also in relation to Black traditions of thought, also, because it's not as though like Black people hadn't developed stories of their own, right, which legitimated and valorized Blackness, from a Black context, right? Right, there were thinkers, right, who were very much aware of the way in which it was necessary to retell the story of Black identity in a way that was empowering and so forth, right? So it's not as though Baha'u'llah's metaphor, the people of the eye, was in its elevation of Blackness quite a statement in that period of time, right? But we had to recognize also that there were within Blackness, there were means of sort of girding up, you know, a people by telling different stories. So I think that when we think about the story of identity that is given to us by Baha'u'llah, we have to understand it within an arc of history that leads us into a future, right? This stuff is not just about redeeming a people for the sake of redemption itself, right? This is about building the foundation for a unified humanity, right? This is one step in a process that leads us into the future. And so we can shift now from our historical vision, from a kind of new stories that we develop through new historical envisioning, right, to new stories about prophetic vision, right? We have to have like a point to which we are aspiring to. And you know, I think I would say that in our culture today, we have various kinds of stories about the future and possibility, right? Um, there's one story that tells us, don't worry about anything except yourself and your material well-being, right? The best you can hope for is the improvement of your own condition through material gratification. It's a very shallow and facile story, yet at the same time, it has great power, right? And I don't think it's necessary for us to sort of degrade that story too much. All of us are involved in a kind of desire for material well-being, right? But there's certainly a limitation to the kind of inspiration that we can draw from this kind of personal fulfillment through material means. That is, I think, one of the ways in which capitalism sort of keeps us going forward. How are we going to keep a society going forward? Well, just tell the individual that they're going to be all right if they can gratify these needs through accumulation and consumption and so forth, right? Then I think there's another kind of vision also, which is a vision which has been given to us, through what we can call humanistic thinking, right? there's a sort of a narrative of humanism that supposedly sort of comes out of Enlightenment thought in Europe, which says that we can work together through human machinations, right, to create a better society, and that the means that we do that are democratic, right, and these political structures. So we have political structures which are meant to sort of develop not just a betterment of the individual, but a betterment of the society, right? And that we can do that through purely humanistic means, that we are just, as human beings working with one another, we're going to be able to do it, right? And I think that in this moment, right, we see the continual failure of that purely political means of transforming society for the betterment of all, right? And the sort of the disintegrating structures of democracy, right, which we have so palpably witnessed in just the past, few months, right, um, lead to a lack of hope among many people, particularly among African Americans, right? If you talk to a lot of African Americans, and how much are they willing to invest emotionally, right, in this story about the eventual eradication of white supremacy and the eventual possibility of equity within the American nation, right? You see a lot of lack of hope, right? Because those political structures, which have been the promise, right, for the improvement of the lot of all people, have continually shown themselves to be hypocritical or to be insufficient. And you will talk to many people today who say, I don't see an end to white supremacy. I don't see it happening. You know what I mean? So the prophetic vision that we have is yet another one that moves, I think, above that, right? It's a vision that is grounded in a kind of spiritual perception, right? A understanding that it is through divine prescription, right, that we will ultimately be able to build this kingdom of God on earth, which is what we are trying to seek out, right? We are trying to build as Baha'is nothing less than the civilization of God here on earth. That is as it has been promised in the past, right? That we will see God's kingdom come on earth, right? That's what we're involved in. And so in order to, have this kind of this vision, and in order to achieve it, we have to do some things. It's not like, this is not like a miraculous kind of process. It's not going to just come to us, right? It's going to come through the labor and through our work within the divine blueprint, which we un- unfold from the revelation of Baha'u'llah, right? And so we know that one of the things that we need to do, right, is in this moment in time, develop community. That's so desperate. This is what our work is, right now. We're trying to develop community. That's what the Universal House of Justice has bid us to do. And so I think that we need to, my personal feeling is that one of the ways that we can do that is by building community with those who we are closest to, right? Those who we resonate with. We don't have to go, like, some people want to go save the world, right? But they have people right next to them who they could be building community with, right? So I think that one of the ways that we build community is by engaging with those who are right next to us, right? Who are our friends, our co-workers, our family members, right? These are the groups the Universal House of Justice has bid us to engage, right? I'm gonna tell you a little story. Um, as I said, like, the theme for today is for me is storytelling, and this is a picture